Hi, I'm Bernice Unger, a tax law specialist in the IRS Office of Employee Plans, Washington, D.C. Today we are talking with Bob Architect, one of our senior tax law specialists. Bob, let's discuss the final 403B regulations.
Bernice, it would be my pleasure to do that today.
Bob, what was your involvement with the final regulations, and who should be interested in these regulations?
Well, I'm privileged to say that I was one of the people involved in actually drafting the regulations. As to who should be interested in the regulations, any employer who is an educational institution, a public educational institution that is, who sponsors a 403B should be very interested in these regulations. In addition, a tax-exempt employer, specifically those described in Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code who offer 403B retirement programs to their employees, should also be interested in these regulations.
Well, Bob, there certainly have been a lot of changes over the years. I also see something issued about 414C. Is that something separate?
Well, yes, and I'll get to that in a moment. These are the first final regulations for 403B in just about 43 years, and you could well imagine that over all that period of time, there was quite a bit of legislative change in the area affecting programs described in 403B of the Internal Revenue Code. This was our opportunity to consolidate all of those changes in one spot for an issue of going to one-stop shopping for your guidance on 403B. Now, you ask about 414C. It's important to note that what we're really dealing with here is not just a single regulation myopically affecting 403B, but yet a regulatory package. And one of the most significant items in this package, and one that has to be given a lot of attention by any tax-exempt organization, is a regulation under 414C, the technical portion of which we'll go into later, in regard to determining who an employer is should we have a controlled group situation. So that would be of interest to any tax-exempt organization for all benefits purposes.
What is the effective date of the regulations? Does everyone have the same effective date?
Well, Bernice, before I actually get into the effective date, I want folks who are listening to this and looking at it to realize that we have placed footnotes on many of these graphics. These footnotes will provide to you a citation to the applicable section in the regulations. You can find these citations listed in the addendum with links directly to the applicable section. Now, that said, as to the general effective date of the regulations, it is for taxable years beginning after December 31st, 2008, so really January 1st, 2009. There are some notable exceptions to that, which I'd like to go over right now. The first notable exception under what we call delayed effective dates applies to situations of collectively bargained agreements. But it's important to understand that it is only where the 403B is directly affected or even established as a result of the collectively bargained agreement being in place that those collectively bargained agreement situations would experience a delayed effective date. So when you look at this delayed effective date, should you be in a collectively bargained situation, please realize that it doesn't apply only because there is a collectively bargained agreement, but yet where there is a link between the 403B and the collectively bargained agreement itself. Another item that would experience a delayed effective date are churches who sponsor 403Bs. But here again, it's important to note that a church sponsoring a 403B would only experience a later effective date where the 403B plan itself is an outcome of a church convention. That is where the church convention has the obligation to either establish the 403B or amend the 403B. So merely because a 403B is sponsored by a church does not in and of itself mean that it's going to experience a delayed effective date, but rather, again, where the authority to amend or establish the plan would be with the church convention. There are also a number of removal of what we call varying permissively excluded groups for purposes of the universal availability requirement, which we will discuss at length later on in our talk. In regard to removal of these groups, there will be experienced a delayed effective date. And finally, certain governmental 403Bs for limited universal availability purposes will experience a delayed effective date also. Here it's extremely important to note that merely, as I said before with churches, merely because a government sponsors a 403B does not in and of itself mean that there is going to be a delayed effective date. It's linked only to varying requirements of universal availability. So if you're in a governmental situation, please look in depth in the regulation to see if you're affected by the delayed effective date. Now, in regard to delayed effective dates, we have another category of items that are going to experience a different timing outcome. These are called grandfathered items. Remember, I said the regulation's general effective date is the 1st of January of 2009, really for taxable years beginning after December 31st, 2008. When we talk about grandfathered items, what that really means, Benice, is that if you, for example, had a certain contract in 403B or a certain specific item under that contract that are enumerated in the regulations, what happened prior to that date may not necessarily be affected by the regulations. And grandfathering means what was there will continue to exist. Some of the areas that experience grandfathered treatment are the in-service distributions from 403B1 annuity contracts, incidental life insurance contracts that had been issued as part of the 403B program that a participant may have, post-revenue ruling 9024 contract exchanges, as I say post, as we talk about later, as we move past that revenue ruling that dealt with in-service transfers to 403B, we will find that prior in-service transfers will generally experience this grandfathered treatment.
What was the primary purpose of these regulations?
Well, I'm glad you would ask that because the regulations not only deal with putting in one particular place the guidance of 403B, but the theme of the regulation is to really diminish the extent to which these 403B programs differ from other programs that might be maintained by the same type of employer on the same platform. And what that means basically is if you were dealing with a tax-exempt organization or a governmental organization that had a grandfathered 401k, or as I said, a tax-exempt organization that has any 401k, they may be running that on the same platform along with their 403b. If they're governmental, they may also be running what's known as a 457B government eligible plan. So the idea of the